Dairy virtual farm tour. And second, I'd like to thank the World Dairy Committee and the Richler family for allowing us to sponsor them for the virtual farm tour. For those of you who are geographically challenged, where they are located at in Bainbridge, Pennsylvania, is in the southeast part of Pennsylvania. It's about 2 hours out of New York, or 2 hours north of Washington, D.C., and about an hour from Baltimore or Philadelphia. This puts them in the Chesapeake watershed area, which offers a lot of environmental challenges, along with a lot of urban sprawl challenges at the same time. Just to give you an idea of the Chesapeake watershed area, there are 17 million people in that part of the country that is in the watershed. It covers 6 states, and this area is the size of Wisconsin, and the population in Wisconsin is about 6 million, so that puts a lot more urban pressure on that farm down there. Today we have with us the Richler family. There's 2 of them up here going to present, Jason and Jordan, and they also have their other brother who made the drive in from Pennsylvania this morning, Jarrett, in the back. They also have their nutritionists with them today, and it's Dan Hilliard over here.
All right. My name is Jordan. Like you said, this is my brother Justin. We came out here on Tuesday from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Bainbridge is in the northwest corner, located up by 3 Mile Island. I know a lot of you guys have heard of that place before. Good and bad, I guess. So it's been a pleasure to come out here. We'd like to thank Quality Liquid Feeds for sponsoring us. We had a good time seeing some quality Wisconsin farms yesterday and got to see the beautiful countryside you guys have to offer. And also we have our wives with us, my wife Laura, and Justin has his wife Melissa and son Gideon and daughter Adeline with us. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of what we focus on our farm, which drives our production and our quality product, milk. Today I'm going to talk about producing quality forages and what that means to us. And also, like he was saying, we have to watch our phosphorus and nitrogen levels on our farm because we are in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is kind of in the national spotlight right now. So there are a lot of restrictions that are put on us, and we have to be very careful about our farming practices. Also, we're big on records. My Uncle Don, who was unable to make the trip, he's big on spreadsheets and uses spreadsheets to calculate costs of production, costs to feed the cows. He can track any costs through the cow to the finished product.
It's kind of funny that we're standing up here talking about conservation, and for some of you that might know, we're very, very soggy wet right now. And if you're from Texas, I apologize for hogging all the rain, but we're talking about limiting runoff, and right before we came out here, we got about 18 inches in 2 weeks. So anything that was in the streams and creeks in the Northeast made its way down to the Chesapeake Bay. So, we didn't have any manure out. Actually, we were just getting ready to haul manure, and we had our 2 feet of freeboard on our lagoons, which is required. And by the end of that rain, we were very, very much at the top. And we had to call in and just tell them, hey, this is one of those 24-hour, once-in-a-lifetime, rains that we got here. We were good, but we're really pushed right now. If we get another couple inches, our lagoon's going to be running over. And they were getting calls from everybody. There wasn't a lagoon in the neighborhood that we could have taken manure out to put in because everyone was running full at the same time. We have since gotten some out with some sunny days, and now we're having nice weather back home. I just want to show a picture of our family. We're kind of unique. We're only 750 cows, but we do have a lot of family involved. Starting on the left is my brother Jason, and his wife Jessica. All our wives, they support us wholeheartedly, but none of them actually work on the farm. Jess is a large animal veterinarian for Country View Farms, hog enterprise. So she gets around the country. Then it's Jordan, his wife Laura, my dad, and my mom, who works at an elementary school. my Uncle Don and his wife Mim, who is a retired librarian, my cousin Eric, and his wife Heidi, who is a realtor, myself, and my wife Melissa, who is a high school chemistry teacher, and then Tanya Baldwin's been with us since 1998. So the ownership, we have 4 partners. I just joined the partnership in 2011 here. My Uncle Don joined in 1972 with my grandpa. He did 2 years of service in the 1W rather than being drafted, and he was in partnership until my Uncle Brian bought in a couple years later. You won't see Brian listed up here. Brian was in the partnership for a while. He actually was in partnership with my dad, who joined in 1980. And they formed together as the 3-way partnership up until 1998. And then in 1998, he made a decision he didn't want to farm beyond 50 years old, and he opted out. And it was a 2-way partnership between my Uncle Don and my dad for a couple years. Eric joined in 2009, and then I joined in 2011. Tanya Baldwin came on board in 1998. She was an assistant herd manager for my dad up until about 2006, 2007, and then my dad transferred a lot of the day-to-day herd work over to me, and so now she's my assistant. My older brother Jason's been on the farm for 8 years, and my brother Jordan has been on the farm for 3 years. So some industry awards. My dad and my Uncle Don and Brian were named Master Farmer way back. I think that was back in 1980 or 1982. Just recently we got an Industry Pacesetter Award. One thing that we do exercise and we do meet regularly is with our profit team, which is with our nutritionist Dan Hillier, banker, accountant. We have a moderator that moderates the meeting. Our veterinarian, I think that's everyone, and then everyone on the farm. And so if there's any big decisions that need to be made, we ask the profit team for guidance, hoping that we can all be real, we can all be candid in those meetings, and they can give us the best advice on how to go forward. Case in point, back in 2005 when we were looking to expand, we told them what we wanted to achieve with production, cell count, cow health, and we were kind of set on doing a mattress barn with sawdust. There's nothing wrong with that system, but they said, hey, what you want to achieve, you'd be better off going with sand and a freestall barn. We were real hesitant to do that, knowing that sand separation systems can get quite extensive, and we didn't want to take on new projects right away with the expansion. So they took us around and they said, why don't you look at some of these farms that have sand and see what you think. There are ways to do sand separation without having mechanical separation, which is what we wanted to avoid. And so we went around and we ended up going with sand, and it was one of the best decisions we've ever made. And we have to credit the profit team for that. Knowing what we wanted to achieve, they told us what the best route would be to get there. So we milked 270 cows in 2002. And we had a barn fire, pretty devastating barn fire. Happened 10 days before I left for college my freshman year. So put a lot of strain on the family. We lost a bank barn. We actually would have lost a lot of cows had it not been for the fact that the cows were used to going in a direction away from where the fire had started. And so my uncle ran out there, moved a couple pieces of machinery out, opened the gates, and the cows just kind of meandered out on their own. But we lost a bunch of wet calves that were below the bank barn in an old tie stall setup. And it was a devastating fire. We knew God had a plan for us, and we knew that that happened for a reason. That kind of put us in a process where we built a whole new feeding setup, which we have a picture of. We wouldn't be able to feed the cows as efficiently now if we didn't have that fire, and allowed us to build a brand new feeding setup and allowed us to change a few things around. Our calves are now in a much better environment than where they were. So employee-wise, we have 9 full-time, 5 part-time. Like I said, Tanya's been with us for a while. Full-time worker equivalent, we track that pretty closely. We try to be between 15 and 16 every month based upon 60 hours a week. I think it's 230 hours a month for ag. We have employees that do all milking. They're all Hispanic labor. When we first started, I kind of opened up my sites to employing everybody, I should say, and I noticed that the Hispanics and the non-Hispanics, there always seemed to be a communication barrier. Not just communication barrier, there's also a lifestyle barrier too. And so as we kind of went on since 2007, 2008, 2009, I started shifting away from part-time labor and went with 100% Hispanic labor, thinking maybe this is the way it should be, knowing that they would probably work better together if they all could speak the same language. As we made that transition, it seemed like cow flow in the parlor got a whole lot better. It seemed like milk quality got a whole lot better. Accountability from employee to employee got a whole lot better. It's a decision that I look back on and I'm really happy I made, because how can you expect a part-time person that comes in only 2 or 3 times a week to perform the same as someone that's milking 12 hours a day? And so it's, that's one thing that I encourage people to do is, if you can cut out some part-time labor and if you can afford the benefits of a full-time person, I think you're going to get better performance from your employees simply because of consistency. It's also funny, as soon as we started milking, it seemed like milking took forever. I couldn't get them to put 120 cows through an hour, which we have a double 16 and it's definitely doable. And so I was talking with the guys. I'm like, why are you guys not working faster? You know, you can do things a little bit differently. And they're like, well, we want our hours. We want our hours. I'm like, well, I want my cows to lie down. I don't want them standing. And so we actually went with a different kind of pay scale. I said, I'll pay you for 6 hours. As long as you get the cows milked, you'll get paid for those 6 hours. If it takes you 4.5, great, you still get paid for 6. But I said, I don't want you cutting corners. And so we had to make a deal. We put a camera up in the parlor, and so that's what we do. The guys know that they work two shifts a day, they'll get paid for 12. But in all reality, they're only working about 9 to 10. And so we get the best of both worlds. They get their hours, I get my cows milked faster. And within a week or two after doing that, we were up to 140, 150 cows an hour. So it's learning how to motivate employees, and you know, hours is just one thing that they're always tracking. They have to make a living just like you and I. So details of the dairy, 648 milking. Total livestock is a little over 1,300. 3 milkings a day. You'll notice that the one milking in the middle isn't a true 8 hours. We bumped it up to 11:30 so that we could get out of the barn and to our homes before 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. Double 16 rapid exit herringbone. 2010, we actually, this is not really much of our doing, it's Good Forage is basically attributed to that, but we actually produced 1 million more pounds than the previous year. Numbers are up there for rolling herd, fat, protein. We saw a big jump from when we moved from our old freestall barn to our new freestall barn. A lot of it is cow comfort, and a lot of it's nutrition. We don't have the best cows in the world. They do their job, they work hard, but I wouldn't even say our management's the best in the world. They do because we put them in an environment and in a comfortable stall. We have sprinklers and fans just like everybody else. Somatic cell count. This is one place where we've been working on it. To try to be below 100 year-round is a goal. We're right around that mark. We try to eliminate problem cows. We send udders 4 times a year. We score teats 4 times a year. We have a prep procedure that they must follow. and we culture on the farm. There's a lot of things that we're doing right now. I don't think there's much more than what we can do, other than I think that maybe nutritionally might be the best place where we could probably make a few more gains. It seems like when everything's clicking in the barn, nutritionally our forages are at their best is when our cell count's less than 100. But when we're going through the bottom of one silo, you'll see we feed out of silos. We're kind of unique. We don't feed out of bunkers. We're at the bottom of one silo and the top of another, or when things are just a little bit unstable and you get a few DAs is when the cell count seems to be creeping up. So when we're right in the middle of the silos and everything's going well is when our cell count seems to be at its best. I'll let Jordan talk a little bit about cow comfort.
Like Justin was saying, when we looked to expand, we made a list of goals, and we met with our profit team, and we wanted to meet those goals, and so they pushed us in the direction we needed to. Cow comfort was big for us, low somatic cell and high production. So we went and looked at different farms. We were leaning towards sand, but wasn't sure if we wanted to make that big switch. So we ended up going with sand, and like Justin said, it was one of the best decisions we made. We have a sand bedded barn with a flush system, and we're able to reclaim 90% of our sand and reuse it. Shortly after we built, sawdust got really scarce in our area, price skyrocketed, and we saved probably $40,000 to $50,000 a year in bedding costs just from going with sand. And with that came lower somatic cell and increased production. For our transition barn here, we had part of the barn built before we expanded in 2006. What you see here, we have a Springer pen here, which is most of the time is a bedded pack. Depending on cow numbers, we have a section of free stalls we can open up to give them the option of sand bedded free stalls or a bedded pack bedded with sawdust. On the other side, we have dry cows and a tunnel ventilated barn with sprinklers, and we ripped out the mattresses from our old barn, put in a piece of PVC pipe as a retainer for the sand, and we converted them to sand stalls, and that's all flush as well. And then on the other side here, we built this and we expanded. That's our post-fresh group, and cows stay in there for a few weeks until they're moved into a milking pen. And things have been going well. This is key for us. We install cameras in our Springer pen so we can watch the cows when we're not there and see if anything needs assistance with calving. And our sort area is over here too, so someone's always in the area. If something's not going right or a cow's in labor, someone's always there to assist her. This is a picture of our freestall barn. It's a 6-row barn. There's 512 stalls, so each pen has 128 cows. They're deep bedded sand stalls, and they have no concrete base. It's clay, so it's able to drain out. We use recycled sand. We have to buy in a little bit of sand every winter when the sand isn't draining properly with the cool and cold temperatures. But other than that, we bed twice a week, and with managing our sand properly and our flush water, we're able to achieve the low somatic cell temperatures and keep our costs down. This is a picture of a flush barn. Many of you are probably familiar with it. There's flush heads at the top of each group. When the cows are in the parlor to milk, we have 3 flush tanks, each 20,000 gallons, and they pull from all 3 at one time. And we flush with 6,000 gallons of water in about 50 seconds, and do that 3 times a day. Every time the cows are out to get milked, we're flushing the barns. And Justin's going to talk about the parlor here.
So like I said earlier, the milking parlor is a double 16 rapid exit herringbone parlor with a single return. We shoot to have 150 cows an hour milked, which is about 4.5 to 5 turns an hour. Milk 3 times a day, and we also monitor our second letdown percentage. We try to have that less than 10%, like lower, like even at 5% second letdowns. And milk out in the first 2 minutes, we try to have 55 to 60% of the milk out in 2 minutes. So we monitor those pretty closely. This is our sort rail system. So cows are coming out of the parlor down a single exit return lane. We have different sort gates that kick them into various areas. The second one being a palpation rail, which for our system, we call it more of a shot rail. Personally, I don't like palpating in a palpation rail. It seems like it's too hard on my shoulder. I would rather palpate in a headlock. And so then when we do vet checks, we put cows in headlocks. We have a tiled bunk. We put feed down. There's a watering trough. They usually drink a little bit before they go and get locked up. And then they're there for a little bit, and then we let them out. We also have a hoof trimming table. So the hoof trimming days, we sort out about 40 to 50 head. And they're there. There's feed there so that they're not totally doing nothing. We can at least have a meeting while they're waiting to be trimmed. Calf management, I'll let Jordan talk a little bit about that.
At the farm, this is one of my prime responsibilities. I don't take care of the baby calves. Once they hit 6 weeks, I pick up responsibility. This is a picture of our wet barn. Like Justin said, the barn fire in 2002 was a curse, but it's also a blessing. We were able to update our facilities. Now we have a calf barn that has good ventilation. They can stay warm in the winter. We have a hover we can roll out, and calves have dividers, so it keeps them from sucking and getting into bad habits. It's very efficient from a cleaning out perspective. There's a single gate, 3 smaller gates within the big gate. We can swing that out, pull the dividers out, take a skid steer in and clean it out. So now we have 84 stalls, and they stay in there for about 6 weeks, and we start weaning them at age 5 weeks and then totally off milk at 6 weeks. After they leave our wet barn, they come up here to our weaning barn, which we decided a couple years to make the step and invest in a building that's going to put a lot of growth on the animals when it matters, between 2 and 4 months, get the height on them and the gain per day on them that we want, so we can create a heifer that's going to milk more. No, let me go back. That's going to milk more and eventually pay for itself more from just a facility designed for healthy calves. So we built this 2 years ago. We looked at a few calf barns, but we decided to go with something a little different. It's a high facing roof that faces south, but we actually feed in the back with a walkway. Most high roof barns feed in the front in the sun, but we wanted to keep everything out of the elements and the rain and snow. So we feed them in the back, and then we have a scrape alley that we can clean 3 times a week. And we have 8 pens, and calf health has been superb since we moved in here. We have very little pneumonia, very little cocci, and calves just thrive and do very well in this environment. The only thing is when we get blizzards, it's a mess. But other than that, it's great. It's a great place to raise calves. So they leave there at around 4.5 months, and we put them in a Virginia barn. Half go out there and half go to a custom heifer raiser. Our goal is to eventually bring all our heifers home, but due to a land base and also manure management and the investment costs, we weren't able to achieve that yet. So the custom heifer raiser takes them at age 4 to 5 months. We get them back at 12 months, and we do all the breeding on our farm. And last year, just with better facilities, we were actually able to sell 60 head of cow dairy, and we sold them. Mostly we sold our low producing cows and sold them for dairy, and we were able to keep our heifers to keep the best cows around.
We don't actually use hardly any sex semen. I'm actually a little bit frustrated with my reproduction. For the last 12 months, I'm 55% bulls, 45% heifers. So If anybody has any tools out there on how to get to be more 50-50, I would gladly recommend those. But I can't seem to get 50% heifers on conventional. I don't go more heavy with sex semen because our facilities are full, and we decide to just kind of hold off on building with the economy. So we don't really want to go out and build more heifer facilities. So that's why we don't use more sex semen. Pregnancy rate, it's up there. What we do is we ultrasound ourselves. Made this decision about 2 to 3 years ago. I had an interest in doing it. I had been breeding for a number of years. I've been hearing from other dairymen that to do it on farm, it's definitely doable. And so what we kind of figured out, an new ultrasound costs around $10,000. It's got to pay for itself. So we kind of figured out what we use, how much we spend to pay the vet to come out and do, because we do weekly ultrasounds with the vet. And when you're paying the vet $175 an hour, it doesn't take long for it to pay off. So in the first year, we figured we saved $12,000. So we do that. I use the machine 3 days a week. We do 33-day checks. We do 70-day checks on the cows. I just started doing that this past winter. Wanted to catch the early aborters a lot quicker. And then we do a 150-day check, which is essentially our dry-off check. Heifers, we do 33-day checks, and we do 70-day checks, and then we don't do anything beyond that. When we're ultrasounding, we're not just looking for a pregnancy. We're also looking for cysts, for follicles, CLs. We're not just going to start an open cow on OffSync. We're going to start at the right time. So we're looking for CLs and follicles and making sure we're starting her right in the middle of her cycle. If she's in the beginning or in the end, we're going to wait till the previous week to start her on OffSync. Everything's kind of really simple at MetaVista. I talk to herdsmen that do their own trials on the farm. You know, do I get a better result with double OffSync on heifers versus like a co-sync? I let Paul Fricke do that work at University of Wisconsin. He's the one that kind of runs the numbers. I don't really want to do my own trials on my farm. If he recommends the system, I'll take it 100%. So we are still OffSync 60 on our farm, meaning that we breed 60 hours after the second PG. And everybody is on that system. Every animal, first calf heifer or older mature cow, everyone gets pre-synced OffSync. Set them up to be bred right around 80 days. And we don't cherry pick really. It's about less than 1%. So we try to get everyone through all 5 shots and then breed and then ultrasound at 33 days. The only resyncing we're doing is if at 33 it doesn't look real healthy, we'll resync her so that the next week when we check her, if she lost it, we can PG and breed 3 days later. So that's our system for reproduction. Sires, using Freddie and Super, lots of other really good bulls. What we're looking for, we're not a show herd by any means. We're looking for strong animals with good feet and legs and production. We've used Toy Story and Sharky in the past, and I would actually say that probably Toy Story and Sharky have been some of my favorite bulls. Those animals have done really well in our setup. Transition cow management. We dry cows off, and we try to average rate around 45 days dry, and they go in the Springer pen usually around 25 days prior. Cows with twins that we diagnose with twins are treated a little bit differently. We move them in an extra week earlier, knowing that the energy is just a little bit higher in that pre-fresh ration. So we get them in there, and we can watch them a lot more closely rather than just in the dry pen. As they get closer to their due date, they're put in that bedded pack, and then as they show feet, we separate them out. As they go fresh, they go into a hospital group, which that milk is used to feed our calves. We have a calf pasteurizer. It's actually too many pen moves, I would say, from our farm. They go pre-fresh, hospital, then post-fresh. Ideally, I'd like to just do one move out of the pre-fresh into the fresh group, but we have antibiotics in the dry cows, and we use tomorrow. And so I have to throw our milk, and all our throwaway milk is in an old parlor. We actually have 2 operating parlors. We don't like cows with antibiotics going through our good parlor. Too many risks involved. We actually, we don't have the Hispanics milk the hospital group. We do that ourselves. We do all the treating ourselves. So there's an extra pen move. Once they go into the post-fresh group, they are evaluated every day, udder fill, ketone levels, temperature, stethoscope, make sure they don't have DAs. Like I said, that's the top left is our calf pasteurizer. We got that about 3 or 4 years ago when the cost of milk replacer was going up. And that, if some of you saw the virtual farm tour on Tuesday, Simon Dairy, the payback was 9 months on that. And that's one of the best investments we've ever made, along with the ultrasound. Fresh cows go in there. Cows that are treated with mastitis, the rule is, garbage in, garbage out. So if we have a cow that has really bad mastitis, we're still throwing her milk down the drain. It's only the cows that are not clinical, they're subclinical, they're near the end of their treatment, that are going into the pasteurizer. What's nice about the pasteurizer is, in the winter, with the increased cost in the replacer, they always, Dr. Sheila McGurk, she'll say, throw a little extra replacer in to keep that animal warm. Well, when you're paying so much for a replacer, it's hard to justify doing that. Now, if we have extra milk, it's just going down the drain anyway. Add an extra pint, add an extra quart, on really cold days. And then it's also nice, it's high temperature, short time pasteurizer. So we set the temperature in which it comes out of the pasteurizer. Cold days, we bump it up to 115, knowing that it will cool off, and by the time it gets to the calf, it's usually around 100. So we have that flexibility with the pasteurizer.
For our feeding, we have a pull type vertical mixer. It's a J-Lure. And we feed our milking cows twice a day, except for our post-fresh group. We feed them once a day, as well as our Springer group and dry cows, and all our heifers just get fed once a day. Our nutritionist, Dan Hillier, he comes every 2 weeks, walks the herd, lets us know if he sees anything as far as the manure goes or the feed quality that we should be changing something. And we test the feed every 2 weeks as forages just to see if we have any change in forage quality or if we should be switching any ingredients around. This is a picture of our feed room. With the barn fire, we were able to improve our feeding facilities, be more efficient, feed more animals in a short amount of time. Where this is currently located, this used to be a bank barn that burned in the barn fire. And I remember my Uncle Don telling me that, right after the fire when it was chaotic around the farm, he kind of just, wanted to hurry and get something built so we could get back to normal. But someone in the ag building industry told him to think it out right, do it how you would if you would double your herd again. And so he really thought through how he wanted to handle feed ingredients. At the time, we were at 270 cows. So now that we're at 750, the system still works great, and we could feed another 500 cows with this setup. So we pull in here, we can get all our commodities, and then we can get our haylage and rilage at this one stop just by using switches. And then we go around, put our straw or hay in the mixer, and then corn silage. And the feeding time is drastically cut from where it would have been if we were using our old setup. Just a little bit about QLF. We've been using it since 2005. We're very pleased with the product. It allows us to increase the palatability and desire for the cows to keep eating. I just noticed on warm summer days, I can really keep the cows eating with the QLF product in there, the sweet tasting molasses. They have more desire to come up to the bunk, and they're up there a lot more often. Like it says there, it supplies the sugars and energy, and it creates a very consistent product and feed for the cows. So we feed them the same thing every day. We bore them, and therefore it just keeps them going day to day, doing what they do best, which is produce a lot of milk. And also, to go along with that, reduces sorting was huge for us. Since we started using the product, we have also started chopping our hay and straw. So this is a little bit less of an issue, but right after we started using it, we were noticing the cows weren't able to sort through the hay and straw like they were before, especially our dry cow ration, which is high in hay and straw. Like I was saying before, we are in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, so we pay a lot of close attention to being environmentally friendly. Seems like Big Brother's always watching, and you got to make sure you do everything right. So in 2008, this was another big decision that we decided we're going to go all no-till or we're going to stay the way we are. So in 2008, we went 100% no-till. Just from an efficiency and labor standpoint, on top of the environmental benefits, this was one of the best decisions we ever made. We got past the 3 or 4 year mark where you kind of start to see the yield benefit. And this year, with being a wet spring, late planting of corn, we were on the rye fields when they were wet, compaction. We didn't get the chisel plow out at all, and corn came up even, and our yields were very good this year compared to the drought we had in the middle of summer. And then we had Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee that gave us close to 20 inches of rain, and we were still able to get our crop out of the field this fall. So that has been huge for us and has been a very important part of producing high quality forages. We use alfalfa and rye as cover crops. The rye we use to harvest in the spring for heifer feed. Some of it we just burn down, but all of our silage ground gets planted in rye in the fall, which for this year we're just starting to get rye out because the fields have been so wet. So rye is double cropped with corn. In the spring, towards the end of April, we mow the rye off, harvest the rye, haul manure, plant corn, and it's a complete no-till setup. And for us in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, in Lancaster County, most soils are high in phosphorus. So phosphorus is what limits how much manure we can put on our soil. It's not nitrogen, it's phosphorus. So we have to be careful how much manure we put on. We have to document all our records. And I think in the next 5 years, we're going to be required to use GPS and have flow meters on the liquid spreaders or inject it. I think it's moving more and more that way as restrictions become tighter. We farm 740 acres of crops. What I noticed when we were on tours out here, 400 cow dairy farms 1,000 acres, 1,000 cow dairy farms 2,000. On the East Coast, land is really hard to get a hold of. Cash rents are high, especially with the high commodity prices. Last fall, there was some farms that were bidding $400 an acre and not getting the ground. It was up over $450. We're not paying that much in our area. We're pretty fortunate. We don't have a lot of cash crop farmers to compete with, but we have 425 acres of corn we plant for silage and harvest, and then we have 150 acres for grain and 130 acres of alfalfa and 20 acres of small grain, which is rye that we actually combine and use for the next fall's cover crop. We've been saving a variety of rye for 30 years on our farm, and it's been a variety that's been working well, and it's kind of adapted to our farm setup and does really well from a tonnage standpoint. We own all our equipment, and we buy 50% of our dry corn in. We got away from high moisture corn about 5 to 10 years ago just from a consistency and a mycotoxin perspective. And we would like to pick up another 150 acres so we wouldn't have to buy 50% of our corn. And that's something we're slowly working towards as more farms become available in the area. Like Justin was saying, we're kind of unique at our farm. For 750 cows, we have all upright silos. We have 3 30 by 120s, a 24 by 120, and a 24 by 104. All this is corn silage, so it takes us about 2 days to fill one of these. 30 by 120s, and has capacity of about 2,400 tons. When we expanded in 2006, my Uncle Don put together a spreadsheet, cost of a bunker versus an upright, which composed of the initial cost of the structure, cost to harvest it, to get it in the structure, how much product or corn silage you're losing in a bunker versus an upright. And in the end, it came out to $2 per ton advantage using an upright versus a bunker. So we decided to make the switch to go 100% silos. We do not have any bunkers on the farm, no ag bags, and from a consistency and quality standpoint, the cows have been enjoying the storage in the upright silos. So we have 14,000 tons total storage. We have 5 silos here. We have a total of 13. We have hopper bottom bins that have augers for soybean meal, soy hulls, bakery, and our mineral. And then here we have a commodity shed that we keep hay and straw in, and we chop the hay and straw to 3 inches in length. We have a local outfit that comes in once a week, and we can run 4x3 bales through there, no problem. And it's been working out really well for us. Like I was saying before, my Uncle Don really enjoys spreadsheets, so he spends a lot of time on the computer crunching numbers, calculating cost per acre, cost per ton, cost to feed the cows, just so we know exactly what we're putting into the animal and what we're getting out. So we can reduce our wasted feed, and then it helps us to make very important decisions on which crops we grow and how much it costs us to raise that crop and put it through the cow. So this is our manure handling facility. For those that aren't familiar with a sand flush system, I have another picture here. This is our sand lane. The flush water comes out of the barn, goes down a channel here. This is what we call our sand lane. It has 2 speed bumps in the sand lane. So as the volume comes down through, it hits the speed bump, sand settles out since sand's the heaviest, manure and solids move on through. So we got a little bit of sand here, and then this goes around the corner into our lagoons. So the first stage is about 100% sand, a little bit of corn mixed in, and that's what we pile out here. In the summer, we can return the sand into the barn in about 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how much rain we have. And it's been working well. You know, the percent of sand that you can reclaim is dependent on how good your flush water is. So last year, we actually pumped our 3rd stage lagoon over here completely empty, because you get a thick layer at the bottom. Pumped it all out in the field, and then pumped in pond water, 3/4 million gallon, and started fresh again. So it took us 4 years to get through that cycle, and that's something we'll probably continue to do, because after we did that, our somatic cell dropped 30,000 in 1 month. I'll go back here. Our total capacity is 6 million gallons. Our first 2 lagoons are 1.5 million, and our flush water lagoon is 3 million. So it comes into the one, goes down to the end, flows over, and comes up here and flows back into the 3rd stage. And Justin's going to wrap up here with community involvement.
We believe in educating the public. 20 years ago, we started when my oldest brother was in 2nd grade. There was an interest from the teacher that taught him, hey, we'd like to come out and see your farm. We said yes, and every year since then, they're like, oh, it's a great tour, well, we want to come back. And we haven't stopped. Every year we have 2nd graders. We've actually started picking up some preschools. Some colleges have come in. Actually, this past spring, I think I had like 7 tours, and unofficially, my dad and my uncle have told me that I'm the tour guide. And it's a little bit frustrating, because I was like, I do have work to do, guys. You know, I can't just be giving tours year round. Although I do enjoy doing it, it eats up a whole morning. Or you go around and you pressure wash the parlor, and then like next week another tour wants to come around, and you got to pressure wash the parlor again, and so it gets to be a lot. But we enjoy educating the public. We're all very much involved in our churches. A lot of us go to different churches, so usually if there's a church function, we're not all rushing out of the barn at the same time. So we're involved in different friendship circles and different church circles, so it works out well that way. My dad is past board member at Lancaster DHIA. Don is I would say over-involved. One of the reasons why he's not here is because next week he's going up to Syracuse with Mountjoy Co-op. He's been president for a number of years. To catch Don is very hard to do. He is very, very sharp. I would say a lot of the success of our farm is because of my Uncle Don, because he's a very, very good businessman, has made some very good decisions in the past. My dad, like I said, is past herd manager. My dad's a very good cow guy. He taught me a lot of stuff that I know today, and when he passed the responsibility off to me, I really felt good about it, knowing that he was willing to let me kind of take that responsibility on. So what we're looking at right now is turning it over to the next generation, and that doesn't include my son quite yet. But right now it's me and my cousin Eric, who is, I think he's about 36 years old, and Don is over 60. He's 61, and my dad is in his early to mid 50s. They own 85% of the business. I just started joining in with my cousin Eric back in 1999. We own 15%. So right now they still own financially a lot of the business. How we turn that over, we are seeking the counsel of a transition attorney based out of Lancaster. There's obviously going to be more opportunity for my brother Jared and Jordan and Jason if they so choose to buy in. How we do it in a way that's fair but yet equal. Those words were mentioned on Tuesday. Simon Derry was talking about that. We still need to hash that out. Right now we can't afford, we would like to add a few more cows, but like my brother Jordan was saying, land is hard to get. As soon as a farm comes up for sale, there's all sorts of people that are interested in getting that land. What we have to rely on is a good reputation in the community, doing things right, cropping wise. We have gotten a few acres that way. People have come to us and said, we would like you to farm our land knowing that you guys do things right. So we're banking on that. There seems to be some turnover in the farms as some of the farmers are getting older in the area. Some farms will come up for sale. Having ourselves in a financial position that we could actually buy some of those acres is a priority. And obviously the volatility with feed and milk prices is something that we're always dealing with. So I just want to thank you for listening to our presentation. Not sure how much time we have, but we will entertain questions if you guys have any.